Good morning, everyone. Sabah al-khair, sobh al-khair, in any language, any part of the world you can imagine. It's really a delight to be here. And I want to do something which takes us to another thinking mode, and that has to do with history and objects, and where objects fit into telling us who we are, what we do, what we have done before, where we have been. And I want to do so by way of looking at art, actually, and specifically looking at an object which is just across the way at the Courtauld Gallery of Art, in the first room as you enter the Courtauld Gallery. If you turn right, you will get into a room which is where this object is sitting alone in a case, actually. I want to use it to point to a number of problems, issues that are very present but have historical roots. One of which is this. When we think about Islam or Islamic art or Islamic anything these days, we tend to be taken hostage by essentialized, flattening aspects of Islam. We tend to think of Islamic art when people are shown blowing up monuments or are shown chiseling away and hammering away at sculptures in great monuments of the past. Or we hear about it because some cartoonists have been murdered in the name of Islam and Islamic art, so to speak. So my point here is really about those differences and commonalities and the fact that history in this context matters. In other words, if we were to take the excuse of looking at a silent object in a museum, such as what is known famously now as the Courtauld bag, a metal bag made of brass with inlays of gold and silver, incredibly innocent as it sits in the middle of a gallery, and to think about it in different ways, in terms of a witness of history, in terms of what it tells us about Islam and cultures of Islam, its practices in a historical context, and how we can take this opportunity of being in a museum, witnessing a silent object, so to speak, very closely, reach into different layers, nuances of cultural pasts that have been lost to us. So we go on a tour, a very slow-moving tour of the gallery, which I encourage you to go to at the earliest moment you can. In fact, go to any museum and ponder these objects, telling us stories about our pasts, our common heritage. At the Courtauld Gallery, where this object sits, and you can see it now as the camera passes by it here, it is surrounded by paintings and various kinds of objects made of ivory carved and sculptures that are entirely from a European background, with just a small group of objects of metalwork which come from the Islamic world. It happens to be part of a collection, a personal collection. What is so interesting about walking into a gallery like this, and it's a real unique opportunity, is to see an object which is called an object of Islamic art, representing us with a different side of Islam than everything around it, which is considered European art of Italian and French, for instance, extraction, where these objects, the European ones, are entirely about Christianity and the distribution and propagation and teaching of the faith. The objects in the Islamic category are actually not at all about teaching about Islam. Rather, they are about a culture or a cultural posture, which in fact is much more ecumenical, much more open-minded, much more of an embracing of differences than we expect by looking at, for instance, the media representations of Islam today. So the object, in fact, says nothing about Islam, but says everything about a culture of high literature, of entertainment, of a courtly environment of high language, which was Persian, poetics, and so forth, as well as, of course, a belief that is the underlying context of the whole thing. The object in question is a bag that was made for a woman, a noble woman, most likely. It was made at the highest level of technical capacity, of beautiful, rich rendering of scenes of, for instance, the hunt, as you can see here, which are these roundels surrounding the object, and of princely entertainment. Most extraordinary aspect of this object telling of a time and a place is indeed what appears on the top of the lid here, in this band of inlaid series of figures standing around, in which we see, for instance, two central figures, one of whom is a woman of very high nobility. And there she sits, now in paintings as well as the object, our object. She sits at a very high position next to or accompanied by a male personage, and then surrounded on the two sides with an entertainment scene where she is not only attended to, but also served in the context of this courtly setting. In other words, she is at an equal level of authority, in fact, confers authority most likely at the male companion in this context. These are part of one facet of Islam and Islamic practices, and represented to us through an object such as this, where we see the particularity of a practice that is post-Mongol, that is in West Asia, in the context of a ruling elite known as the Ilkhanids at the very early part of the 14th century. The objects in that room, in the gallery, are all of the general date of the medieval period, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. And what is so telling about these Islamic objects is the fact that they represent a totally different worldview than one that is about propagation of faith. And yet they are called Islamic, actually, without the really intention of teaching anything about Islam, but a cultural context, in fact. Here we see, for instance, how this scene includes scenes of preparing drinks, presenting drinks, for instance, just as much as presenting us
والإقبال
a voice.
والنعمة والأفضال وبلوغ الآمال وصلاح الأعمال والإكرام والإجلال والإحسان والإجمال والدولة بلا زوال والسعادة بلا انفصال والتمام والكمال والسلام.
And it says that is all, saying, encouraging good acts, decent acts, benevolence, generosity, all kinds of conditions that are embedded in thinking about a cultural context, which has multiplicity of people represented within its or under its umbrella. The object was made in Mosul, in northern Iraq of today, which is the city now very well known in the context of our present history as the capital, one of the two capitals of the Daesh the perpetrators of all kinds of atrocities under the name of Islam. Then it was one of the great centers of production of this sort of metalwork technologies that were brand new in the time, that were considered amongst the top of their particular trade, of their art, of their technologies. And they were made for ruling elite that was roaming in West Asia. There was no Iraq or Iran or Syria. Rather, these were under the umbrella of a cultural heritage that was Islamic, that was Arabic in law, in religion, in science, that was Persian in the language of poetry and of high culture, and that they shared these various aspects of a cultural production which fall under the title, the rubric of Islam and Islamic, as a broad category, actually. And I'd like to end this by only pointing to the possibilities of thinking historical, in terms of historical utopias, that there are various moments and definitions of these ideal contexts. This was a moment when, after the Mongol invasions and destructions, murder and mayhem, there is this flourishing of cultures across all of Asia, and this West Asian side of it, which is today's Iran and Syria and Iraq and Eastern Anatolia and so forth. This was a place of tremendous cultural effervescence. And there, various languages, various races and ethnicities gathered under this umbrella, this kind of an imaginary of a new order, if you will. And its arts, what is left of it, these objects, such as the one in the Courtauld Gallery, are witnesses to that history. So as an art historian, and I'm an accidental art historian, I might say, I want to invite you to go to the museums and look at these objects closely. Don't pass them by. It looks small. It needs you to look at it very carefully. But look at them. They are telling us so much more and in so much nuance and so many different textures of a cultural life of the past that we miss otherwise. And if I were to suggest action, I would want to ask everyone to encourage their local museums, big and small, to at least dedicate one room to thinking horizontally across various cultures, to put in together, for instance, a 14th century object from all over the world, if they can manage it. But instead of separating them into countries, into regions, European arts, Italian painting, French objects, Islamic galleries, to come up with something that can actually allow us to see these parallel lives and to think of our own lives in these parallel terms, actually. Thank you.